We know there are diverse perspectives about the Mar-a-Lago saga. We do want to highlight those differing voices. So joining us now, radio host Tony Katz and former Democratic Senator for New York, David Carlucci. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Always.
David, thank you. David, I'll start with you. What is your reaction to the FBI's raid of Mar-a-Lago and the release of the redacted affidavit? And at what point is Congress trying to prove by pushing for more details in the raid?
Well, I think it's just clarity. I think anytime you have something like this with Donald Trump, very contentious, it's very controversial. I think that they're just trying to shed light and give the public as much information as possible so that they can quash any type of conspiracy theories or anything like that, but make sure that justice prevails. I think this is obviously very troubling. You hear calls to defund the FBI, things like that. I think that that's what we're looking for here: transparency, clarity, and so that people have trust in the system.
Tony, what's your reaction?
We didn't get any of that, and that's the problem. The affidavit that was released has so much redacted. We don't have an answer to questions. We don't know what Trump had regarding, for example, nuclear. I thought that was supposed to be a big part of the story. You look at people like Jonathan Turley, law professor, saying that if they thought they had the Goldilocks moments, that was his words, they found the exact right spot of redaction. It's not hitting anybody. They showed in this that Trump was indeed, and his team were indeed, speaking with the FBI. Was this warrant actually necessary? And a warrant that engages the idea of looking for fruits of crime is not something that really comports with the Fourth Amendment, talking about the items to be seized. No one makes the argument that if the president had things he shouldn't have, that's a problem. There is a question about whether or not the president indeed did declassify things. People can ask that question. I would love an answer to it. But the redacted affidavit doesn't show anything and doesn't give us anything about transparency. It gives us more questions and doubt in the DOJ and the FBI.
David, what do you have to say about the level of redactions that Tony was just speaking to, and also the declassification issue?
Well, I think that's why we see the talk about a special master to make sure that there is transparency. And look, it's very easy for us to sit here on the sidelines and judge and cast blame or think that we know the details inside and out. We have to let the Department of Justice do its job. And that's why I'm hopeful that with a special master that there is clarity, that there is transparency as much as possible without giving the case away.
Well, we found in the affidavit that the former president was storing these highly classified information, these documents at his home in Mar-a-Lago. Some of the docs even contained national defense information. When, if ever, is it okay for a former president to keep sensitive information like this in an unsecured location, Tony?
I don't make an argument that it's okay for anybody to keep classified or top secret or special compartmentalized information in a place that isn't secure. I'm not making that argument. I never would. The question here is, what exactly are these documents, and were they indeed classified, top secret, et cetera? That if they had markings that is different than whether or not they were declassified, something we don't have an answer to. If we're going to talk about things we know and don't know, that is something we don't know. Andrew McCarthy had written a very solid piece asking this very question. At what moment is a raid acceptable if they believe there are documents there that they can't get access to, that don't belong at places like Mar-a-Lago or in specific spots at Mar-a-Lago and belong with the National Archives? What we don't have an answer to, and the redaction is a part of the reason we don't have the answer to whether or not these documents were indeed declassified or not, which is a serious part of this. And secondly, what exactly was the access point? There are presidents who have taken documents with them. I don't understand why it happens to begin with. But we have a larger conversation here, not just about the documents, but about the system that was utilized. And trust in the DOJ and the FBI was blown to smithereens with Russia, Russia, Russia.
I mean, do you agree with that, David?
Well, look, it depends on what part. But yeah, there's a certain level that we want to know what's going on. The public needs to be kept in the loop. Obviously, we have a major controversial situation here with a former president and maybe a future presidential candidate doing something illegal, and there's a lot of questions. So it's a fine line to walk. I'm very hopeful that the DOJ is able to do this in a way that keeps trust with the American public, but also does their job. So I understand it's a very fine line. I'm hopeful that the talk that we hear about a special master will give that trust and make sure that DOJ is able to do its job, do it effectively, and if there was wrongdoing, that can be shed, that light can be shed, and people can be brought to justice.
I do want to switch gears a little bit and make sure we have time for this. Let's talk about student loan forgiveness, because that big news, President Biden announcing on Wednesday that the Department of Education will forgive $10,000 of student loan debt for people earning less than $125,000, and that $20,000 will be forgiven for people with the same eligibility that have a Pell Grant. What do you both make of this plan? And Tony, let's start with you.
This isn't a plan. This is a bribe. This is a bribe in an election year, 3 months out from an election. It's a very much a perverse disincentive to the idea that you have to owe up to your responsibilities. And let me say clearly that the people who want to make the connection to this and those who got loan forgiveness on PPP, Paycheck Protection Program, where they followed the law, is so maddening and ridiculous and pathetic and embarrassing. This talking point has failed and failed miserably. Never mind the fact that if you are now engaging this as the president wants to, it's now a spending program up to $500 billion and counting, and the president can't be the one who starts a spending program. Spending comes from Congress. So it's perverse, it's unconstitutional, it's a bribe. In any way you want to talk about it, the American people see it as just morally wrong.
Tony, tell us how you really feel.
I could do more, but we're going to need bourbon.
David, got to bring your voice in here. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think the president is moving in the right direction. We wanted to see this universal debt relief that the president had talked about, but this is a scaled back version, meeting the realities of the time, being conscientious of inflation, but eliminating this $10,000 of debt and $20,000 for people that receive Pell Grants. Over 20 million people will be completely resolved of their student debt. So this is extremely important, and it's relieving and doing something for those millions of people that are straddled with debt and trying to break free. And the president is right to do this at this time, with the deficit being reduced by over $350 billion last year and going into record levels this year. This is the time to make sure that we're giving back to the American people, and people that have been saddled with debt is a great place to start.
Spending $500 billion is not being cognizant of the inflation issues in America. Jerome Powell talking about interest rates continuing to go up to a target rate of 3.75. That's cognizant of inflation.
David, final word goes to you.
Yeah, so the president is not only relieving the debt, but also the payment repayment program, having more options, limiting discretionary income to 5% of that to pay back student loans. And this is going to happen in January of 23 when the remaking of payments has to begin. So when we talk about that, it's balancing out, and I believe will have very little impact on inflation in this country.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.